This lesson for the Cornet Project class I titled Toxic Tactics. Of course, toxic referring to something poisonous, like when we say the dumping of toxic waste, harmful, unsafe, malignant, fatal, deadly, lethal, baneful. In a toxic relationship, for example, very harmful, unpleasant in a pervasive or insidious way. Tactic is an action or strategy carefully planned to achieve a specific end. Tactic number one, feigned fragility. I was unaware of the prevalence and how pronounced this uh, expression of hypocrisy is, to pretend oneself fragile and then have everyone around that person or that particular in group, as I've learned in studying in groups in social psychology and sociology. This author of the book Anti-Fragile, Things That Gain from Disorder, he says we are witnessing the rise of a new class of inverse heroes, that is, bureaucrats, bankers, Davos attending members of the IAND, International Association of Name Droppers, and academics with too much power and no real downside and or accountability. Now you can throw in religionist here, which is what I'm doing, because there is no religion police, there is no uh, governing body or anything to that point. The gospel's been entrusted to the Lord's churches, for example. You can go read the history in the church letters, the reality of what they endured in the New Testament. And then, of course, you can see the persecution, state powers on one side, religious powers on the other. And neither of those powers had any consequence as they both converged and worked against each other at the expense of the middle. They game the system with while citizens pay the price. At no point in history have so many non-risk takers, that is, those with no personal exposure, exerted so much control. The chief ethical rule is the following: thou shalt not have anti-fragility at the expense of the fragility of others. Tactic number two is futility, and this is when you're trying to communicate. And I had not expected so much emotion and reaction when I would work and produce a lesson, for example, and then when I would collaborate with other pastors and primarily a colleague, Dr. Eddie Johnson, and then of course we both are research assistants for our former hermeneutics professor of the seminary. So we would collaborate, work, labor to prepare a lesson, only to have people who had invested no time, apparently no energy, in actually noticing inflectional morphemes, defining their terms from the Bible, for example. And it was just futile for them. It became exasperating for them, not for us, because we were anchored in the reality of the process, that we have no doubt about a process, that you approach a text assuming that you're wrong, assuming you've been primed, knowing that you have pre-understanding, knowing that we have biases. So we approach the text and then we let the text script us, which is the purpose of it. So there is a quote attributed to George Bernard Shaw that follows along the lines: Britain and America are two nations divided by a common language. And it says here that the point is that even though we use the same words, those words can and often do have quite distinctly different meanings because of our cultural differences. Now, when I was a youngster, as long ago as 16 and 17, a professor in the high school was an unidentified Mormon. He never identified himself as a Mormon because that would have been a key term and a trigger to notice the error of his view. But he would use Jesus, salvation, that those were terms that he would then allow students to attribute to those words what we believe that to refer to, and who we believe Jesus to be, the Son of God, rather than what he believed him to be, which was just a brother of Lucifer. That is, Jesus was just another created being. So the conclusion in this slide here is there's even a British English versus American English translation. So without a definition of terms from the Bible, we can't really say we're having a biblical conversation. Tactic number three is term switching. And it's simple for a Calvinist, Arminian, for example. I just placed Calvinist and Arminians here to spiritualize and redefine the clear meaning of biblical texts and teachings so as to be in apparent harmony with the historic Christian faith. However, such a harmony is at best a surface agreement. That is, when you ask someone, let's say a Calvinist, a person who identifies as a Calvinist, who's appropriated their jargon, their formed categories, and their syllogistic reasoning, whatever that might be, they will agree when you say something, but the meanings of the words can be totally different, and that would be based upon double meanings of words that cannot stand the test of biblical context, grammar, or sound exegesis. Now, that was a quote from Dr. Walter Martin, and the rationale he noticed when engaging cults was the same thing with those who support constructs. The same mindset can present itself. And before we move on, I'll read just a moment from some things he had said, and I'll include this article. But Dr. Walter Martin observed that a cult, or as I'm now applying this same rationale, an advocate of constructs such as Calvinism or Arminianism may use the terminology of the Bible, but by no stretch of the imagination can the redefinition be equated with the thing itself. Another confusing aspect of advocates of Calvinism and Arminianism, that's what I've inserted here, their approach to semantics is the manner in which they will surprise the Christian with voluminous quotations from no less authority than the Bible itself and give the appearance of agreeing with nearly every statement the Christian makes in attempting to evangelize, when that is while you're attempting to evangelize, let's say, a Calvinist or an Arminian. It says all such tactics based upon the juggling of terms usually have the effect of frustrating the average Christian, but now the average Christian is a shrinking population in light of YouTube, social media platforms, internet, and you can see the phenomenon taking place as people are now able to go and search out very easily through computer software and then to broadcast very effectively and efficiently through YouTube platforms. So it says here it's the average Christian is unable to put his finger on what he knows is error. Now, what we do here at iamcorne.org is define, document, and disclose the fallible elements within a fallible soteriological construct. And it says that this Christian is repeatedly tantalized by seeming agreement, which, as he knows, does not exist. And that can be very frustrating if you're unable or unwilling to engage in an evaluative process. So we were trained in holistic hermeneutics. That gave us our principles of interpretation. We were trained in Bible Hebrew and Koine Greek. That gave us the tools of language. We then have our categorical approach in systematic theology, for example, where we use Bible categories. And then I'll conclude here with something that is probably the most unexpected breakthrough in Bible research that we have experienced thus far. It's both, whether it's an Arminian or a Calvinist, that is a person who identifies by either one of those, the absence of a lexical definition for their term depravity. So since it holds no lexical definition, then it becomes their term. It has its own meanings and implications. So if you use the word depravity, you'll find that some say, well, do you believe in total inability? And or do you believe in total hereditary depravity? And you're off and removing yourself further and further from the scriptures, that is farther and farther, as this thing through accretion begins to be like the building of an onion. It just becomes layered and layered. But if we just stop and go back, Genesis 2:9 in the Koine Greek Old Testament, and I've worded out the English, you can look at the Koine Greek if you'd like. The tree of the consequence to have noticed and continue to notice a knowable thing of good and of evil. Notice good and evil are now conjoined. But notice G1492, that word adonai is from oidam, insight. And then we notice the word for evil is paneru, G4190. So now we have our Strong's number. We can look these up in the lexicon. We now have the occurrence here, the earliest moment in the history of man and the creation account, where we have the record here of what this tree is. It's of the consequence to have noticed and continue to notice. Well, then Jesus said in Matthew 7:11a, when you take the same word G4190 and G1492, and you go to Matthew 7:11a, it says, therefore, since you yourselves, while being evil ones, have noticed and continue to notice, to be giving good gifts to your particular children. So notice what has occurred here. Even the perfect tense is used in both of those texts. Both use same key terms, and the term evil is mentioned in the English Bible in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And Jesus himself has said that while being evil ones, that is the condition of being, you have noticed. Well, it's interesting that, remember how this started, talking about to those who are bureaucratic and those who hold sway and have no risk. They just make these decrees, and all the little people out there, we have to go along with these massive influencers. However, what we notice here is that the Bible says it's lawful to believe, it's commanded to believe, and to believe Jesus Christ for everlasting life is a good thing. So the Bible says it's good, commanded, and lawful, and yet Calvinism, for example, would contradict it based on its concept identified by a formed category called depravity, which was introduced somewhere in the conversation and has apparently supplanted the term evil itself from the conversation. And then, of course, training in Arminianism won't help without a lexical definition. So you enjoy this lesson and take your time as you go through it, and I'll include excerpts from this article. But you have a blessed day, and beware of those who presume the power and authority to form categories, define terms off script, because it makes, in doing so, the Bible irrelevant.